All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Freeport Comprehensive Plan Housing Workshop. I'm going to give a brief overview of the project before handing it off to Jeff Levine of Levine Planning Strategies. So just for a little background information, we started this comprehensive planning process with the town earlier this year. The comprehensive plan that a town has to do by state law every 12 years, it does a lot. It does broad, high-level vision and guidance, kind of directs growth and development in the town, and provides that framework for policy development, planning work, and everything like that. What it doesn't do, you see here on the right, it is not the plan of all plans. It doesn't direct any specific policies, change any ordinances directly. That's part of the implementation that follows the plan. So what we're here to do tonight is to talk about how housing in Freeport relates to the comprehensive plan, how this can inform future growth. But before we talked, Sam introduced the town staff, planning board, council, board, and committees. Everyone is playing a big part in this, and so does the public. North Star is working with Cedar Landscape Architects, Levine Planning Strategies, and FB Environmental to put together a lot of the inventory chapters, run the workshops. And what the public does in this situation has provided surveys. This is the second of 4 public workshops. So we had nearly 500 participants in our public workshop and visioning survey earlier this year. The planning board has done a lovely job of popping up at community events, tabling, getting the word out, emails, and again, all of the information is on the website, futurefreeport.com. So what we've done this far, the first half of this year was focused on drafting the inventory chapters, which are now posted on the Future Freeport website, so please provide your comments and feedback through the form on the inventory chapter page. So the inventory chapters are an overview of 13 topics in the town, from demographics, marine resources, natural resources, and housing, which is why we're here tonight. So task 2, highlighted at the bottom there, is visions and values. So right now, we're really seeking as much public feedback to form a vision to guide our policy and strategies that North Star is working with the planning board to develop. So we're taking all of our feedback from the housing workshop, the future workshop, the future visioning workshop, environment workshop, which is in 2 weeks, and then finally the future land use workshop, to really frame a vision statement that reflects Freeport and the values and what we heard from the public. So is this going to be handing off soon? Yeah. So tonight we're going to be focusing primarily on housing. I know that housing can really affect multiple different topics, conservation, economy, but generally we're going to be focusing on housing. So the purpose for tonight is to get the feedback of the community. We're going to be providing some information that we found through state census data, as well as what's in the inventory chapters. As I mentioned before, this has major impacts to visioning. And again, the ultimate outcome is to direct policies and strategies for the comprehensive plan for the next 12 years in Freeport. This work will be really critical for the future land use workshop on November 18th, where we talk about where do we want to see growth in Freeport. But tonight we're specifically talking about where do we want to see housing, what types of housing, and how do we get more affordable housing in Freeport. And to do this, I'm going to introduce Jeff Levine from Levine Planning Strategies. He's been working alongside North Star on a lot of the housing features of this comprehensive plan. So I'll pass it off to Jeff.
Thanks, Charles. This is really fun. I think I have this new appreciation for in-person meetings post-COVID, so it's so great to see you all here. Thanks for coming. Can I just get a quick show of hands? How many people have been to like a few of these types of events before? So yeah, so you guys are old hat at this. This is great. One of the things we're going to do that maybe is a little different is we're going to use an online system for getting feedback from people. So you don't have to do this, but we definitely would encourage people to do this both in the room and who are listening online. We're going to be asking some questions through this platform called Menti, and you can join through www.menti.com and type that code in, or you can scan that QR code, either way, and if you're watching from home, you can do that as well. You'll be able to answer these questions until October 4th, so if you don't have a chance today or you just want to pay more attention to what other people are saying, that's fine. But we'd love to get people's feedback on this. It's not sort of the be-all and end-all in terms of getting answers, but it is a nice part of it. So first off, I think we're going to ask a sample question. So let's start with a sample question here. Is today September 23rd, 2024? So this is your chance to log in, give your answer, and you see it's kind of fun. It does it live. You can change your answer if you decide, wait a second, I want to be, don't tell me what day it is. It's September 24th. You can change your answer. So someone did that. Yep, so it does work. And yeah, so then when the number starts to slow down, you know, again, people can still keep answering it, but we're going to move on once it starts to slow down. So I see 39, 40. It's not quite slowed down yet. 42, still going. Good. If it was not the 23rd, I'd be in the wrong place. So this is great. Okay, we're going to stop and move on. I didn't see the thumbs up. That's kind of fun. Yep. So if you like the question, and you can do a thumbs up. And so there we go. Okay, let's move on to actually what I'm here to talk about. So just a quick background. My name is Jeff Levine. I'm a principal with the Levine Planning Strategies, and I teach urban planning at MIT. Before that, my background was really as a municipal planner. So I'm always interested in these sort of local level projects and working with cities and towns on making better communities. And lately, a lot of that, as you know, in Maine and around the country, has been concerns about housing affordability, housing style, housing type, and housing options. And then, you know, just it's really something that's it's a big planning issue right now. So we're going to talk here about the housing inventory. I'm not going to ask how many of you have read the housing inventory yet. This isn't a quiz. But you'll get a taste of the written housing inventory in the presentation that we give here. If you want to see more, there's a lot more information in the actual inventory. But this is sort of the Cliff's Notes. We're going to talk about just how many units are available in Freeport, what kinds of units they are, what kind of inventory you have in terms of housing stock, thinking about planning for more growth if that's something that the community identifies a need for, where it would go, what type it would take, and what types of housing there might be. So just sort of covering the issue from a few different angles. So we're going to do another Menti now. If you could answer what kind of home do you live in? And your options here, I think we've covered all the bases here. Single family or mobile home, 2 to 4 units, 5 to 10 units, larger or other. You might not know exactly how many units are in your building. That's okay. Just do your best. And let's see what people respond. I know we can get it to at least 46. That's what we did last time. So not surprisingly, we're seeing a lot of single-family or mobile home residents. That's the built character of Freeport and a lot of communities in Maine. Some multifamily and some larger buildings. That's probably actually a little more unusual statewide, but certainly in this part of the state, that's more common. Oh, and I see an other. That's great. I'd love to hear more about that. So this gives you a sense of the people who are responding in the room and online. Let's see what the data shows in terms of what makes up the housing stock of Freeport. Oh, we actually have another question first. What's your housing arrangement? Do you own a single-family home? Do you rent it? Do you rent a multifamily? I think other also would include if you own a condo. Sorry, we didn't have a category for that, but feel free to use that as a proxy. And let's see what people say in terms of owning and renting, because obviously that's also a big part of it. Do you own your home, and then it depends a lot when you bought it. Maybe if you bought it a long time ago, it would cost a lot more now, and you might not be able to afford it. If you were lucky enough to finance it 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe 4 years ago, you probably got a much better interest rate than you get today. Things like that. And rent is obviously much more affected by the market generally. But we're seeing a majority of people who own a single-family home, which again is not that surprising for Maine in general. So here's what in 2022 generally the Freeport housing types were. And it was about a little more less than 80% single-family homes, or 1 unit in some format. And then, it was broken up into a bunch of different categories, but maybe about 8 or 9% mobile homes, and the balance in multifamily. And an interesting range of multifamily, not all 2 unit, 3 unit, but really a mix going all the way up to over 20 units. So again, probably slightly different from the responses that we got tonight, but not dramatically so. And then we look at what's actually getting built in Freeport. So we went back to 2010, and we looked at the building permits for residential development to see what types of housing has been built. And you see this fairly consistent layer at the bottom of single-family homes, one-unit buildings. You know, it starts at 25 right after the recession in 2008, goes up a little bit, actually goes down a little bit, goes back up, but generally bouncing between 25 and 50. And then you see these sort of jumps in multifamily. And you see a jump in 2012. You obviously see a big jump in 2021 when the Desert Road project got its building permits. So this isn't exactly the same as number of building permits. This is a number of housing units that got permitted by pulling a building permit. But again, you see this fairly consistent single-family home development, and then you see sort of more of a swing in other types. And then you see this sort of accessory apartment numbers, which have been creeping up generally in the last few years as well. So it's interesting to see these trends over time, and to show that even coming out of the recession in 2010, it wasn't as slow here in Freeport as in some places. This has a lot of information on it, so let me sort of walk through it one piece at a time so you have a chance to digest it. First, the big chart on the left shows how many housing units were estimated by the US Census Bureau in 2010 and 2022. And you see it's gone up a little bit, not as much as you might think in 12 years, but it shows a little bit of growth in occupied housing units. And what's interesting is that you actually see a bigger increase in vacant housing units. And I'll talk in a second about what vacant housing units means. It means a couple of different things. But you've definitely seen that number go up more than the occupied housing units. And the total number of housing units in that 12 years has gone up probably 8 or 9%, as shown by the building permits that were pulled on the previous page. In the upper right, we try to separate it out by owner-occupied and renter-occupied, similar to what you did on Menti just now. And it shows that about 4 and 5 units are owner-occupied. And that's actually gone up in the last 12 years a little bit. The renter-occupied units have actually declined in that 10-year period, not just relatively, but absolutely. And then you see the total in occupied housing units. It's a little different because of how different American Community Survey calculations occur, but the same basic idea that there's been an overall increase in that time of about 5 to 10%. In the bottom right, now we'll learn what vacant units means. The census counts a few different types of vacant units. And there's more than just these 3, but these are the 3 biggest ones. They're vacant because they're for sale. Somebody's moving, they moved out of their house, they haven't sold it yet, it's on the market. Or it's new construction that's just finished and it hasn't sold yet. And that actually, as of 2021, the estimate is about 106 units in Freeport in general. It's interesting that in 2016 it was actually 0. And I wouldn't assume it really was 0. The way the census calculates most of its things like this is estimates. So it's 0 plus or minus a certain margin of error. Sometimes they're vacant because they're for rent. Either they were just finished, or a renter moved out, or the owner decided to renovate the unit and kept it empty for a few months to fix it up. And you see 53 units like that as of 2021. Then, of course, we have the first thing people think of in Maine about a vacant unit, that it's a seasonal home. And that is a fairly big part of the market overall, but not as big as it is in a lot of parts of Maine. So it's about 300 units. It seems to have been going up a little bit lately. But really the big driver here seems to be the vacant for sale and for rent units, not as much the vacant seasonal. So while there's been growth in seasonal homes in Maine, not as much as you might think. One thing I want to touch on is that, I said I worked in local government for a long time, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how to provide goods and services to residents, ideally without increasing taxes. Nobody likes to have their property taxes go up. No one likes paying their excise taxes. I always got that when I worked in a local government. So when you think about the different types of housing development, you look at also what kind of tax impacts that might have on the community. And there actually are not a lot of studies about this generally. There's been a lot of studies of individual developments to see what their tax impact are. But this is one of the only studies that I know of that really looks at the idea in general of what's the tax impacts of different development patterns. And generally what it found was that the sort of compact development patterns where you put multiple housing units on the same lot. You try to sort of build in a village center or in a place where there's goods and services. Generally, that does save communities money in terms of their infrastructure, their roads, their sewer and water, if there's sewer and water in that area, other public expenses. And it can be fairly significant. It's on average about 38% according to this study, but it can be higher depending on where you are and how far out those patterns might be. It also estimates that the ongoing service delivery, once you've built that area, is also lower. Not as much lower, but a pretty solid 10% lower to provide ongoing services to a place that's sort of closer to a growth center than is maybe further out of town. And then I think the most significant one is how much revenue do you collect in terms of property taxes, and the estimate here, and it varies on the specifics, but that you can get about 10 times as much revenue per acre if you build in sort of what's called a smart growth way, where you have dense development, multifamily, maybe small single family. All right. I haven't memorized all these slides, so I'm really glad you were able to plug that in. So again, just to close up, generally, if you're thinking from the city or town side, the municipal side, generally you're able to get more revenue from this compact development, so providing services is slightly less expensive, but you're also collecting a lot more revenue. And in general, that should help keep people's property tax bills. I wouldn't say they wouldn't go up, but they might not go up as quickly. So when you think about development patterns, that's not a reason to do it in and of itself, but it is part of the overall planning thinking when you think about what type of development you want to see in a community. Oh, now my forward button doesn't work. No, it's always something here. Like that? Oh, I'll just do this. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about where recent development has occurred in Freeport. And then we can think a little bit about where the housing should be situated. That we're not going to answer those questions right now, but later on, we're hoping to get some conversation going about this. Thinking about things like how close is housing to transportation? How close is it to work? When people have to get to a job, how can they get there? How far do they have to drive? Are they able to walk or take the bus? How close are they to schools and healthcare? Can kids actually walk to the local school? Is there a school bus? For people who need healthcare, similarly, how do they get to their healthcare? And this all sort of comes together in terms of how the community should prioritize different types of housing development. We're not going to answer that question finally tonight, but I think we're going to have a good conversation about it, at least I hope so, and we'll come back with some recommendations that will then go to the town. So let's do another Menti now. Where do you live in Freeport generally? And I know this maybe doesn't cover every single place. Where would you classify where you live in Freeport? All right, so we're getting a pretty good mix in some neighborhoods, not as many in some others, but at least one in each of these, so that's good. And certainly, what's interesting is sort of how evenly, relatively speaking, it's spread out. And I think that's consistent with what I would have guessed just from what I know of Freeport, which probably isn't as much as a lot of people in the room. People are still voting. All right, let's move on. So this is just a visual way of showing building permit dates, and this is building permits for, as opposed to the other one, which showed essentially one permit for each housing unit. This just shows a dot if there was a residential building permit pulled in that spot. So whether it was one unit or multiple units. And it's hard to develop immediately a sense of what this means. The different colors show different years. I think my quick takeaway from this, it shows that there's been a fairly decent spread of development around the town, probably more of a focus sort of southeast of 295 than northwest. But really in many parts of the town over the last 10 years, you've seen a reasonable amount of housing development, and this is just housing development. You'll see we can blow up on a couple of different subsections now. For those of you who know the geography better than I do probably, you can see right near downtown, right near Main Street, to get a sense of where there's been housing development since 2014. and then just going out onto Wolf's Neck and showing some of the development that's happened over there, particularly Flying Point and South Freeport. Not as much in South Freeport, but still some. So really, just sort of getting a sense of where the housing's been built in Freeport, and I think the answer is yes, there's been housing built in Freeport, not necessarily entirely in one area or another, but kind of slowly and steadily in a lot of different parts of town, a little more focused in some places like near downtown perhaps. And then you can see that also the sort of interesting cluster up there at 136 in that area. So we've talked a little bit here about sort of housing quantity, how much housing there is, housing type. Let's talk a little bit about affordability. That's obviously a big issue in housing. Can people afford to live in the house or the apartment that they're in? If they don't have a place to live, how do they find it? How do they find one they can afford? Can you find secure housing without having to compromise other essential needs? And there's a general measure that people use in planning and housing development. It's really general, but it seems to be fairly consistently used, and it seems to generally be an indicator of how much you can afford housing without sacrificing these essential needs. And that's, are you spending about 30% or less of your income as a household on housing? And that can be a mortgage or rent. It generally includes things like heating and insurance and all those other things that go with sort of operating a housing unit. But in general, if you're spending 30% or less of your income as a household on that, you generally have enough to meet your other essential needs. You may not be saving, but you also aren't having to sacrifice those other things. You're able to pay for transportation, for food, for healthcare, for recreation. And again, everything's a little random in some ways, but this seems to be a very durable method of measuring it, and there seems to be some evidence that at that point is when you really start to get burdened with your housing costs. And you can tell that there's some truth to that based on how mortgages are underwritten and how landlords often look at how much rent you can afford to pay, because they all seem to generally use numbers close to that. We can look then across different income levels at different affordabilities, because obviously 30% of a very low income is a lot less than of a higher income. And as a corollary, someone at a higher income, even though they're likely to spend less than 30%, could actually afford to spend more than 30%, because they still will have more money left over than the household at a lower income. But there's definitely a range of housing affordability levels, and we're going to touch on that a little bit here. And then just the importance of how affordable housing generally on the community. There's the primary concern. Can I get a place to live that I can afford? Can my family get a place to live that we can afford? Can my friends get a place to live they can afford? But then as you go beyond that and you think about the services a community provides, you start thinking about, can school teachers find a place they can afford? Can firefighters find a place they can afford? Can the people who work in the retail downtown, can they afford to live in town? And if they can't, how do we feel about that? So let's do another Menti now. Can someone in your family, imagine someone in your immediate or extended family just starting out, maybe right out of high school or right out of college or whatever, could they find an affordable place to buy or rent in Freeport based on what you know today? And obviously there's no magic answer here, but what's your initial reaction if somebody asked you that? So seeing an interesting mix, certainly I don't think so, is jumping out there, which I guess I'm not shocked by that. I am a little surprised how much, but certainly seems to be a sentiment. Some, yes, but it may take a while, which is a little more promising. It means, hey, if you can hang around and stay in my basement for a while or something, maybe you'll find a place eventually. I see one, absolutely, and then I see a couple I don't knows. And I love I don't knows because there's a lot of things I don't know as well. But certainly the gut reaction does matter, and because you probably have a better sense of the market here than I do. Okay, so let's look a little bit about home values, and this is really looking at home ownership now. What this chart shows is it tracks Freeport with 4 other peer communities, and it tracks the median home value from 2012 to today. So the median home is exactly halfway between the cheapest home and the most expensive home in town. It's sort of like the average, but it controls for that $20 million mansion or that house someone got for free by sort of controlling for those numbers and really just taking essentially the average of the more normal numbers. I'm butchering it a little bit, but that's basically what it does. And you can see, obviously, in all these communities, those values have gone up, except Durham has stayed pretty steady, surprisingly. It's gone up a little bit, but not as much. So Freeport has gone up. I think, not as much as Yarmouth, but certainly it has increased from around 275,000, now, maybe 425,000. And this doesn't really control for changes in income, for changes in other costs, but even when you do control for those, you are seeing an increase in Freeport. Again, not as much as in some communities, but more than in others. And when you look at different sales in 2023, the most recent year that we were able to get good data for, because 2024 is not over yet, you look at the average price and the median price. Again, they're slightly different measures, but measure roughly the same thing. You see the number of sales of condominiums, general commercial development, land, undeveloped land, or basically raw land, manufactured homes, and single-family residences. And you can see the closed prices. I think the single-family residence number looks pretty high. Not surprisingly, it's a very attractive place to live. Even the condominium number is probably higher than many places around here. Again, because people want to be in Freeport. It's a nice place. And then you look at the land, which is if you start thinking about building more housing to maybe try to affect these prices, you still have to pay that price for land. So the land is still pretty expensive. I will say this doesn't control for the size of the land parcel at all, so I wouldn't go too far with this, but certainly showing healthy land prices as well. Manufactured homes still have some room to go up. It does seem to be a more affordable option in Freeport, as it is in many communities. So then you sort of take that and you start adding in the income of people, because that's only one side of the equation. What do the houses and the condos and land cost? And then you take that 30% measure that I just described to you, and you say, how many of the households in these communities are unable to afford the median priced home over time? And you compare, in this case, you're comparing the state, Cumberland County, and Freeport, and you see how many households just coming in would not be able to afford the median home. Why are they able to be here? Because many of them bought their home earlier when they could afford it. Because you look at even in 2010, 70% of the households in Freeport were unable to afford the median home. So they either were getting really lucky and finding a really inexpensive home, or they'd already bought their home, or something else, some other factor. But even starting at 70% coming out of the Great Recession, and then topping above 80% of the households in Freeport, if they had to move into Freeport today, would not be able to afford the median home. That doesn't mean they wouldn't find a place to live, but they couldn't afford the typical home. If you just open up the paper and say, I'm going to go look at that home, there's a good chance they'd say, oh, I won't bother, I can't afford that. And it's higher than both Cumberland County and Maine. Not dramatically higher. I think this is a statewide issue, but certainly at numbers that are generally not sustainable if you want the same types of residents over time. It doesn't mean the houses will go empty. It probably means people with higher incomes will gradually move in because they can afford the median home. Then you look at rentals, because this so far has just talked about home ownership or condos, and you do a similar measure, looking at incomes on the bottom, starting at less than $10,000 a year, a pretty low income, all the way up to $100,000 or more. And in this chart, you'll see the blue, the dark blue, are the households that are cost burdened, that are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And in the sort of lighter green, the households that are paying less than 30% of their household income on rent. So you see, again, not surprisingly, but maybe a little surprising how high it is, the number of households at the lower incomes that are struggling to pay their rent. They're paying more than 30% of their rent. So they're not paying their rent because they might not be a renter for very long then, but they might have to sort of, buy cheaper toilet paper or things that maybe they don't want to do. They might not be able to go on vacation that year. They certainly would struggle to put money away for an emergency. So going all the way up to about $50,000, you see a struggle to rent in Freeport. So what do people do about it? Well, one way that communities try to address this issue is by working with nonprofits or government agencies or housing authorities to build housing that is affordable at those levels. And they usually do that using a combination of subsidies from the state or federal government, sometimes local assistance, sometimes nonprofits, most often layering several of those together to try to piece together a project where, when it's built, the rents can be lower than what they would be otherwise, because they've been able to put these other funding sources into the project. And the Freeport Housing Trust has been sort of one of the biggest movers on that in Freeport. And here's just a list of their properties in town. They actually have 183 units at a range of sizes. Some are specifically for certain populations, over 62 are disabled or over 55. And then some of them are more sort of what we think of as family-sized units. The 3-bedroom units at Village View or Varney Square are probably more intended for a household with more than 1 or 2 kids, because it's really hard to raise 1 or 2 kids in a 1-bedroom. The good thing about these units is if somebody's lucky enough to be able to get into one of them, hopefully that means they're no longer housing burdened. The challenge is there's only 183 of them. So that's 183 relatively lucky households, but most likely most of them aren't moving necessarily until they have to. So these don't necessarily turn around on the market very often because it's kind of a good deal for the residents in most cases. So what else can you do about it? The way I like to think about it is you have this sort of whole toolkit. Us as planners think about all the different ways that you can try to do things like make more affordable housing or change the market so maybe there aren't as many people housing burdened or so that the firefighters can afford to live in town. And there's a lot of these different solutions. I'm not going to go through all of them. But the important thing to think about is that it doesn't mean that all of these solutions are right for every community. I think of them as a tool. The analogy that I have up here is you can have a hammer, and that does a great thing if you need to bang in nails. But if what you're trying to do is fix a necklace, a hammer's not very useful. So you might say, that's a great tool, but it's not really going to address this need we've identified. I need a pair of pliers. The other thing to think about is these aren't really as simple as a hammer or a pair of pliers. You might think of them as an adjustable wrench or something like that, because each of these tools can be kind of fine-tuned to your specific situations in different communities. They tend to have variables that you can change at the local level through local ordinance or through local policy, so you can make them sort of more appropriate to what you need to do. If you say, well, this basically works, but instead of what they did over in Cumberland, I'm going to do it a little differently. You often have that option. And that's sort of what's fun at the local level and also challenging. There's some general sort of categories of strategies. There's really what's housing preservation. This is really focusing on preserving those existing units, particularly the ones that are affordable. Either they're subsidized and affordable, or they're just naturally affordable, like potentially manufactured homes that tend to be less expensive. How do you make sure those units aren't lost to the market? How do you make sure they don't get so run down that they're no longer attractive places to live? Sometimes whatever subsidies were given to them will expire, and the owner will have the option of making them market rate units, which may be okay, but if you want to preserve them, you may then have to find another way to make them affordable over time, which is often involves putting more public money into them. There's the regulatory tools. One of the cheapest ways to fund more housing is to change the zoning to allow more housing on a piece of land. It's almost free to communities. And it's obviously not easy to do, and it involves a public process and some understanding, but it does have the benefit of basically adding value to a piece of land at almost no public cost. Financing, this is when you get more directly into the funding business, either as a local government or working with state or federal partners, and actually put money into the housing development as a way of keeping it affordable. And then finally, what's sort of household-based or demand side, this might be providing direct support to households. Some communities provide direct rental assistance to low-income residents. Other ways of providing assistance directly to renters or owners. You might have a program where you fix boilers for homes of low-income residents that are broken, things like that. It can be pretty costly because it's sort of money that gets spent and then it's kind of gone. But it also does help keep residents in their homes, which obviously people value. No one wants their neighbors to have to move out because they can't fix their boiler. And there's a lot of different subcategories in these categories. I don't want to go through all of them because I want to have time to hear from you. But each one of them has sort of subsets of tools. For preservation, you can preserve the units which are otherwise going to go to market rate. or you can have something like a land trust that owns the land and that keeps the building affordable. There's a lot of different ways you can play with zoning or local regulations by allowing things like accessory dwelling units, providing density bonuses, looking at your parking requirements, things like that. The household-based systems, which might be, again, providing direct rental assistance or home buyer assistance. Some communities look at tenant protections in terms of making sure that if they don't have to move out because maybe they are struggling 1 month to pay their rent, maybe they can provide them with some protection for 1 month, things like that. And then finally, the financing tools, things like local affordable housing trust funds, putting local tax increment financing into developments, preparing sites for development by putting in utilities or cleaning them up with maybe with an EPA grant, and maybe just saying, I have a piece of public land we're not using, let's offer it for housing development below market price and see if we can make some permanently affordable housing on this site because the town doesn't need it anymore and we feel we need more below market affordable housing. There's a lot more tools than that, but I wanted to give you a general flavor of them tonight. So just to summarize, thinking about making it easier to do infill development is certainly something communities like Freeport can look at, removing unnecessary regulatory barriers. You've done a lot of that already in Freeport, and it's been really interesting to see it starting to work. Looking at cost-effective infrastructure investments, if I decide that I have an area that I want to see grow densely, I'm going to need to make sure it has water and sewer ideally, otherwise I'm going to have to manage septic load and things like that. Looking at other funding sources for affordable housing from the state or federal government. And also looking, and I know Freeport's done a lot of this, looking at your downtown core as a way of producing more housing, because you already have this beautiful downtown with a lot of infrastructure in place. Some of the retail spaces aren't really doing what they were doing before COVID as a retail space. Maybe there's a chance, as your downtown plan talks about, of doing more housing downtown. With that, I think we're going to move into sort of more of a question and answer and discussion. Just a quick set of guidelines. Let's sort of stay focused on housing and the comprehensive plan. I don't need to tell you, obviously, we'll respect all voices here, and we'll be brief because there's a lot of people who I'm sure are interested in asking questions and offering their opinions. And allowing people to finish up before getting up and speaking. I think we all will have a really good conversation here. So with that, I am going to bring up Ben Smith and John Egan. There you are. I'll let you introduce yourselves a little bit, and there is going to be some more mentees, so don't put away those websites yet. Should I sit down?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben Smith. I'm the principal at North Star Planning, working with Charles at North Star to manage the comprehensive planning project itself. Jeff is on the planning team as well, so I'll turn it over to John.
Hi, I'm John Egan. I've lived in Freeport for quite a while, almost 30 years. I work in Brunswick for a nonprofit housing organization called the Genesis Fund. I'm one of your town councilors, and I get to participate in the very dynamic housing committee of the town council. And we have lots of ideas that you're probably going to hear some of tonight. So looking forward to this conversation. I'm here wearing a couple of different hats as a member of the community, certainly as a member of your elected council, but also because of a lot of perspective that I can pick up and share because I do these kinds of workshops around the state, helping communities and organizations work on solving housing issues.
Great. Well, we will be taking questions from the audience. I did want to say we do have a bunch of refreshments provided by the town in the back, so don't feel free to get up, stretch your legs, explore those. And we also have a children's room over here, which is supervised, just to share some more information. So we are going to go straight into the first Menti. It's still the same code. So this will be the first, kind of similar to our first topic. So given the current housing types and affordability issues in Freeport, what is the right mix of housing to build over the next 10 years? You should be able to rank it.
And as folks are filling that out, there's going to be a couple microphones going around the audience, and I would certainly encourage you to ask questions for us. I hope that there will be some conversation among the audience as well. And the idea here is that we've got about 45, 50 minutes or so have this be a relatively free-form but facilitated conversation, and we'll use Menti to help do that.
Yeah, so we're looking at these first few answers coming in, we have about 35 that generally the size of between 4 and 20, so that small to medium multifamily size development, as well as a 20 plus kind of balanced with the single family. I guess, before we get to the first question, I can't see too well. Before, any initial thoughts on this before we pass it out for the first question from the panel?
On the Menti?
Yeah.
No, I think just thinking back to the numbers that Jeff was sharing earlier, today it's over 75% of the existing housing stock is single family. So it'll be interesting to hear from folks, just what that means around the future mix. I think this question was trying to get at having what we have in town today, what should the future building mix look like?
So at this time, if you do have any questions, please raise your hand and we will. Caroline's going to be coming around with the microphone.
Yes, one thing that this doesn't show is it doesn't show the disparity of the pricing of single-family homes. And one thing, I happen to live in the north part of Freeport, and when I'm riding around, I get around quite a bit, there's an awful lot of homes that what I would consider that are not affordable for people of lower incomes. And I'm not talking about people that are desolate or anything, but just the average person. I see very few, like mobile homes or manufactured homes going in, but mostly they're the larger, more expensive single-family homes. And so when you look at how many new homes there are in Freeport, most of them, or at least I would think most of them, are very expensive type of homes, not something that I certainly could ever afford to have. I built my house back in the early 70s, and luckily I've been able to stay there. But I couldn't go out and buy a single-family home today, not, where I would stand. So I would like to see us have more of these manufactured homes, maybe more trailers in different parts of towns that people can actually afford to purchase. Thank you.
Do any of you want to take a first response at that?
I'll start. The part of what is happening, John, is that or has been happening for a while, is that the private market is going to go where the demand is able to be met, and the financing for the kind of home that you're talking about, the cost of the materials, the cost of the land, and the demand has pushed. And so the market's going to go to the easiest, most efficient way for them to churn out product and make a profit. That's what the housing and construction industry does. And those dynamics from short supply, high prices, and high demand has pushed that price way out of the reach of people who get up and go to work in the morning. And you can see that in the data that was shown earlier, that the recent sale prices, median sale price, over $800,000, or average sale price over the past couple of years. If you're working in Freeport at one of the many fine businesses that we have here, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to afford an $860,000 house. So the challenge is, what can we do as a community, what can we do as a town government, what can we do with our partner organizations to try and create those stepped opportunities that are below what the private market is just pushing higher and higher and higher. And there's a lot of complexity there. I agree with you, manufactured home parks or organizational areas where you can put in a higher density of manufactured homes creates affordability. The infrastructure to put that in today is still quite expensive, and you need a good-sized parcel of land, and those are pretty hard to find that's on a roadway and possibly might be on a water or a sewer line. So the opportunities to do that are very limited because of our infrastructure limitations.
Yeah. Jeff or Ben, do you have anything to add?
No.
Great.
We have a question from Naomi over here.
Yes.
We learned recently that the state has a dearth of 84,000 units across the state. In your inventory and projections, have you honed in on an ideal number of units that Freeport needs in the next, 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so in the inventory chapter, I don't have those quite, I was trying to pull them up as you started speaking, but we know that the population is expected to grow from anywhere between probably a very conservative, 1,000, 1,200, and a more, larger estimates of population growth in the next 15 to 20 years could be 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 on the high end. So when we try to project how many housing units we do need, we kind of compare it to the average household size, which I believe in Freeport was 2.4, but between 2.4 and 2.7 offhand. So we take the number of total, the population growth and how many units are needed. That number is in the housing inventory chapter, I believe, and I don't want to do the mental math in my head. But if I did it real quick, on the high end, it would be between 800 to 900 units. For more conservative, we're thinking about 300 to 400 units over the next 15 years to accommodate growth. And that's just based on population projection, nothing else. Is there when it relates to, especially looking at the slide we have up here, so for the panel, how can this type of 4 to 20 units kind of help account for population growth or new populations coming in, or in the same vein as like affordable housing?
I think the one thing I'll say real quickly is it's an interesting question when you look at a map of town and you think about those kinds of numbers. Where are those units going to go? And are they going to go in, single-family homes that are kind of spread out the way we saw on that map, kind of north and west of 295 over the last 10 years? There's been a lot of development along existing roads and new subdivisions. Or are they going to appear in more in the growth area? I think one thing that jumped out to me on that map of where growth is happening is that there's a relatively few new housing units in the downtown over the last 10 years. And I think that there's been some recent planning work with the Downtown Vision about changing that and thinking about how to get more activity downtown in the form of people living here as well as coming in for shopping during the day. So we will be tackling that question next, but your question really kind of begs that thought of if you need to build something on the order of 1,000 new homes in the next 15 years, where are they going to go?
And I would also note, I just looked this up, the Downtown Vision Plan from a couple of years ago was calling for 1,200 new residents in the downtown village area. And typically we're looking, instead of thinking of many homes, single-family homes, that'd be more single-bedroom, one-bedroom, two-bedroom units, rental units as well. So that's just in the downtown area.
Got a question over here.
Yes.
When you're putting that data up, you're really not considering rental or ownership, right? You're just saying units. So, because there is some behavior differences between trying to buy a condo or renting, an apartment. So, we thought through that process.
Yeah. Jeff, do you want to explain that dynamic of renting versus buying?
Sure, and it is possible to break it out both by rental versus home ownership and also at different income levels. It gets a little less, you can only break it down so much, but you can come up with a sort of a general sense of what the rental market is versus the home ownership market. And as many challenges as there are in the home ownership market in Freeport, mostly that most of the houses are too expensive, it's probably easier than getting a decent rental just because there aren't that many of them in Freeport. So that's the type of thing that we'll look at in terms of recommendations, in terms of, is there a bigger need for more rentals? How does that fit in with the downtown vision versus building condos or single family homes? So you can't come up with sort of generally breaking it out. I wouldn't say it's not brain surgery. You're not breaking it out quite as specifically as you might like. As you get larger areas, as you get statewide, you start to have more precise numbers. But there's definitely a need for both. There's definitely a different dynamic for both. Renters may not be certain this is where they're going to be forever. They may not want the responsibilities of homeownership. They may not have a down payment. A combination of those things may be true. And ditto for homeowners. And sometimes a homeowner is a homeowner because they were able to buy a home a long time ago and they don't want to move. Renters often don't have that luxury because they don't tend to have that stability. They're a little more dependent on what the property owner wants to do with the property. But I'm glad you raised that point. I think there are ways to break up that just sort of absolute number into sub-markets.
I think it's critical, too, to understand that what we as a community or what Freeport as a town and our organizations try and do is we're trying to address an immediate need and respond to immediate demands and focus on changing regulatory issues in our land use ordinance. But we're also, I think, don't forget the context of the comprehensive plan is to really look into the future and not just respond with, we're going to do 807 units and 90% of them are going to be within this square area. But we're really looking at how do we actually make the community sustainable over that 12-year and then for the next one, the 24-year period. And so just immediately pushing the needle all the way over to one side, we have to do this, or all the way over to the other side, we have to do that. I think it's important to recognize that what we're trying to do in the comprehensive plan is to provide a number of opportunities because the market's going to change. Prices are hopefully going to level off. I'm not sure they're ever going to come back down. But there'll be different opportunities for single family and for rental that may pop up. At this point, I don't think there's any disagreement that the number one contributing factor to the unaffordability and the lack of opportunities is that there's just no supply. And so we have to start doing all of this, at least in some fashion, and getting something going. And so putting up 20 units may not really solve anybody's issue, except for maybe the lucky 20 people who get to move into those apartments. But what it does is it sets a pattern then where we get used to looking at what a 20-unit building might look like. And we get a little bit more experience with what the pattern is for permitting that. And then that might invite other developers to come in and say, well, Bob here put up a 20-unit building, so I'm going to try and do a 15-unit building here. And we have plenty of developers in this room today who would tell you that if a community is welcoming, then they're going to take another look at it. And so we have to get ready as a community to look at not just what we're going to build this year or next year and be afraid of a number that says 500 or 1,000, but to really look at the long-term sustainability of the town that we all love. And it's a nice mix of residential and commercial. And everywhere that I go, people say, oh, you must be thrilled to live in Freeport with all that commercial activity, keeping your taxes low. And I said, you'd be surprised. So we have something here that we probably overlook continually, which is that we have a broad commercial base that we could leverage further. And in order to make that more vital, we absolutely need to have more people living downtown. And that's where the density can happen, and that's where it should happen. There's lots of data that guys like Ben and Jeff could pull up to show you building single-family subdivisions on 2.5-acre lots may be what people want to see. That's not going to solve much for the people who are trying to find a place to live in Freeport today, but long-term, it actually is it's a bad idea for maintaining tax growth constraint. It costs more to support those neighborhoods in rural areas the further you go out in time, and that's proven data. So to keep your taxes under control while trying to grow, it really is, there's lots of data to show doing it in the village center and doing it under a higher density than one house per 2 acres is the way to do that. So it's a double win. We get to control our tax growth and we get to attract people to our community, and we provide housing for people who work in our community. The last thing, I don't know if we're going to talk about commuting patterns. Is that going to come up a little bit later?
We don't have a slide or anything that talks about commuting patterns.
Well, just think about how many people who work in Freeport live in Freeport, and how many people who live in Freeport go someplace else to work. And the census can give you those lobes, and you can see where the overlap is. And I just did this with, I won't name the town, a particular city that's very close to a very popular national park up the coast. And they looked at their data, and they were the community members, the council and planning board and people involved in stuff were amazed, but then again, maybe not so surprised, that there was a huge circle of people who lived in that community who traveled out to go to work. Mm-hmm. And then there was another huge circle of people who didn't live in that community, but drove in to work in the jobs that were in that community. And the overlap of the small amount of people who lived in that community and worked in that community was 10% of what the two larger lobes were. And that's the people that you're trying to grow. Those are your sports coaches, those are the people that help kids in theater in the high school, those are the people that volunteer for your town council and your select boards. They live there, they work there, they're committed to that community. And so it's just a reminder that we're trying to build housing for immediate needs right now. We're also trying to look at the long-term sustainability, but what we're trying to do is get back to a healthy community that we all have in our minds of people that live here and work here and want to contribute to the community.
Thank you for that good answer to the question. I will want to do one more in-person question before I pivot over to Kyle. If we can get Kyle a microphone for the next question, so we can see if there's any chats on the Zoom, but we're over there, yes.
Hello. I'm intimately familiar with probably 6 or 8 different towns around the state where I have properties and pay taxes. And inevitably, those with the higher densities have much higher local taxes than those with lower densities. And while it sounds beautiful to have, we get all these wonderful high-density housing things, and many of the slides that you put in there seem to discount the fact that it's a bigger burden on our school systems, which is by far the highest price tag in our town budget. So I guess I'm asking, this all presupposes that high-density housing and more growth is a good thing. Shouldn't we have that discussion somewhere, or did I miss that and I'm just late to the party?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that is part of what the discussion here tonight is. I can tell you that there was some research done by the Muskie School related to that. The Cliff's Notes version is that very rural communities with very low levels of service have very low taxes. And there's a tipping point at around 5,000 people in a town where all of a sudden you need to start thinking about staffing a fire department, and maybe you start thinking about having your own police department, and maybe you need to have some kind of municipal wastewater system. So I think that there's a point at which the taxes relative to a population are quite low, and then they spike. And if a community can recognize that, some of the slides we talked about were, there's one slide in particular where Jeff was talking about different kinds of development pay more taxes than other kinds of development. That is something that the town should consider in this discussion, but it is not the factor in what kind of community overall do you want to live in, or what a certain part of town looks like relative to another part of town. I don't think anyone, based on the visioning survey that we'd done earlier in the year, wants to see Freeport turn into Somerville, where you've got 20 units per acre from one end of the town to the other. I think that what we did here is that people value the town's open spaces, they value the small villages, they value the activity of Freeport Village, and there's enough room in town for different kinds of development patterns. There's enough room for different kinds of housing. But I think what we need to do is, and this is part of this discussion, is having a thoughtful discussion around how much development is appropriate in different parts of town, and what are parts of town that really should look very similar to the way they look now 40 years from now. So, one of the things I wanted to, be a contributor to is something we touched on earlier, is like there's a lot of trade-offs in housing. Housing impacts the economy. Housing has impacts on open space, transportation, and I think all of that needs to be part of the discussion when we're talking about how much housing is appropriate in different parts of town. But
I just want to follow up, though, that I think that a part of the dynamic with school funding and what does higher density then equals more kids then equals higher taxes, that's not a straight line math equation all of the time. Sometimes it may be that way. And the school funding formulas and the reorganization of how schools are organized, and there's a lot that certainly could be further ironed out on that for sure. And in our community, where we have a rich, robust list of services, our education bill to the Freeport taxpayer is almost 74% of your property tax bill goes towards schools. And we have a broad array of services, and we have a broad array of different tax revenue sources, from commercial and personal and business property tax, as well as individual homeowner property tax. So in other communities that don't have that diversity, the demand is even higher. And yet, one of the single most driving factors of getting people to come to your community is, what does your school system look like? And if your school system is going through disinvestment and either numbers are going down or the all of the myriad of scores that are available, that can be a heavy influence on whether or not people come to your community. So the two are together, and there's plenty more conversation than what we're going to have tonight about how to optimize that for sure. But I understand your point. It's very burdensome to figure out how to balance a school budget that is across a regional area when towns are going town by town. And that's somewhat of the friction what we have with home rule. We tend to not think regionally very well.
I've got one over here.
Real quick, I did want to pivot over to Kyle over there for an online question real quick.
Yeah, so we have 3 online questions as of now. So I think this first one ties into something that was already asked maybe, but maybe you can expand a little bit. Jennifer asks, how will the values of Freeporters be solicited and discussed and connected to housing visions and affordability solutions in particular?
Great question. And as I pass it over to the panel, I do want to say there is a new Menti question up on the screen about where new housing should be built in the next, where new housing built in the next 10 years be located. But the panel to the previous question.
Yeah, I think we've talked about that a little bit, and I want people to understand that this conversation, just like the visioning survey and the workshop we had in June at Freeport Community Services, is all part of that visioning process, trying to understand what is important and what's valued, so that when we think about recommendations and policies and those kinds of things, it's going to be based on information from these kinds of events.
Let's go
Do you
back.
want me to,
Yep.
Yes.
Do you want me to go through all the online ones now?
Sure, we can do that.
If there's new ones, yeah.
Yeah. So question 2, is there any consideration to extend greater density for multifamily housing south along Route 1, where there is a lot of open land with water and sewer available? In particular, this refers to areas below the rural residential trestle near the LL Bean campus. People could walk to work, and the west side of Route 1 near 295. Hotels are allowed there, which are obviously high density, but do nothing to help with housing needs. Why not multifamily in that area, which is also excellent for transportation needs?
Yeah. What do people in the audience think of that? I see a few heads nodding, that maybe.
Yeah, so the question was saying where,
Related to this.
Related to this, so we see that a lot of people in the room are responding to where new housing should be built. So a lot of people are saying Freeport Village, but the online Zoom question came and asked, what about the area south, Route 1 south, on the west side of Route 1, kind of in these areas that aren't significantly developed, and also what these bottom three on the screen show: the east-south of Route 1, west-north of Route 1, and near I-295 exits. Kind of consider the access and to transportation, whether it's by car, close to the interstate, easy for commuting north and south, but also just where bus routes are mostly located. So really trying to grasp about, if we're going to be building new housing, where should it be?
It just so happens we have a work group right now of community leaders, and our economic development director is leading a research on that particular area. It happens to be called the dog bone, because if you look at the shape on a map, it's sort of skinny in the middle along Route 1 with sort of lobes of activity on either end of it. And that's the first step towards really taking a look at that. What can we do to promote those kinds of higher density residential opportunities? And the reason why it looks like the way it does on a map is because that's where the infrastructure is. That's where the water and sewer and the open land merge, where like we could actually put 20 units up here without having to wait 6 years to get water and sewer bonded extensions, which is very complex and very expensive.
Hi, I'm Joe Miliaccio, Freeport resident. This is all great stuff, good planning. Been part of 3 or 4 of these comprehensive plans. Over the years, I moved back to Freeport, having grown up here. And I just want to say, I kind of found I found the presentation editorial a bit presumptive, oversimplified and leading in some areas. It didn't get much better, John, when I started hearing stories about how things work in Washington County, Ellsworth, and in the Acadia area. For instance, the assumption that people can't afford to pay more than 30% of their income does not take into account at all wealth, assets, and ability to pay. It also doesn't take into account things like earned income tax credits and other transfer payments. Just the one statement about I just hope if we can go forward, be a little less biased and leading. The assumption that these are the people that are having to buy the cheaper toilet paper to get by. What about the seniors, or those of us with high quality jobs someplace else that we use to be able to afford to live here and move back? Also, the statement you made about increased density via zoning to increase more units is virtually free to taxpayers. Again, kind of leading, it's not, okay? Let's get all the economics on the table at the next meeting. What are the costs of the current and future water, sewer, and education availability? We all know the state rigs the system, unfortunately, against people in communities like Freeport. We're a minimum receiver of state funding for our community. We pay most of the bill ourselves. And please, let's try to reach out to other communities around us. The assumption that we need to tackle this individually is not realistic with the fact that we all commute. So could we please get together with Yarmouth, Brunswick, Pownell, Durham, and tackle this, we'll call it workforce housing, together? Is that something that you will be doing? And please consider, maybe I'll be here the next meeting for the environmental stuff, but we don't have an unlimited ability to process sewer and supply water in this town. Not sure if some of you know, but I have a property or 2 up in this district, and the water quality stinks. The further you get away from the Merrill wells, the worse it gets. If you go on to Noble Drive, where I am, and some of my folks and friends, they've got sediment, it's the end of the line. So if we were gonna do anything instead of Route 1 South, would you be willing to consider Route 1 North, and how do we process all of this waste and water? virtually for free. Thanks.
So there's a few questions in there, so we can take it one at a time. Jeff, did you want to respond to the impact of the upzoning or zoning changes and how that kind of...
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think all I meant was that actually changing the zoning on a parcel is not an expensive thing for a community to do. As with any property, there'd be a process of reviewing through site plan or through other processes whether there is adequate infrastructure to serve a development, what upgrades might be needed for that development, things like that. But oftentimes the zoning on a piece of land sort of precludes even having that discussion and precludes the possibility of doing anything than perhaps a single family home on a large lot. And in that case, as a for-profit developer, a developer is going to make the biggest house they can and sell it for as much money as possible. That's the American way. But if you open up opportunities for other developers to come in and say, hey, I can pay for upgrades here if I can do 10 units, just allowing the community to have that conversation is something that the current zoning often limits. And that's what I meant by that. In terms of the 30%, I did say at the beginning that's a somewhat just a state of the art, what people use. They found that it's fairly reliable, but it does also factor in earned or unearned income from wealth. So obviously if you have, $1 million in the bank, you're making money off of it. That would be part of your income for that calculation. Again, I'm not going to spend a ton of time defending the number. It's just one that's generally used as a benchmark, but it does include that unearned income.
I think another portion to that question that I think is important is kind of the regional collaboration in housing development. Do you want to speak? I think all three of you have experience with this, but how working with other communities, whether directly or with like a regional planning organization or with the state to develop housing goals, housing policies can be, how Freeport can slot into that.
Yeah, and I'll just start. I would love to give the audience more time.
Yeah.
I don't think we 3 or 4 need to speak to the audience all night long, but John raised an important point in regard to how commuting patterns and how local jobs don't always match with where people work. And understanding those things can be an important part in deciding how much more housing is appropriate or possible to build in town. I think ultimately these decisions will be made on a local basis, but I think that based on the numbers we're seeing, that there is a mismatch. Right now, there are a lot of people from outside of town who come in every day to work in Freeport, and there's an awful lot of people from Freeport who leave in the morning and go work somewhere else. So,
and there's no judgment on that, right?
No,
there's no right or wrong
it's
or
not,
up or down or
it's
good
not,
or bad about it. It's just the patterns.
And it's not abnormal, but I will say it is a little higher in Freeport than it is in some of the other communities in the region, which does have implications on a number of other things that are important to the town. So with that said, I think I'll end it there.
Yeah. So I will, next question, but I will also pull up the next Menti slide, kind of phrasing into what Ben was saying, what are the community's priorities? Do we have a question over there, Caroline?
Yeah, we have a whole line of people.
Yeah, let's make sure we
Cool.
can hear more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. What I don't see in this is age. So looking around the room, no offense, but we're all older. And our increase in our numbers in the last 10 years, even 5 years, do you have that jotted down, what the average age is coming to Freeport? Because it does affect our schools. It may or may not actually affect our schools. If everybody's coming and building these mansions, I'll call them, they're coming to retire in Maine, I think. I could be wrong. I'd love to know what those numbers are, so it'd be great to know multiple housing, who's going to be getting these houses. I know that Portland is extremely expensive, and so further north, those workers will travel. And even though you want to supply people in Freeport to work in Freeport and live in Freeport, those people coming from Portland are also going to be coming to Freeport to look for housing to go back to Portland. And we do have a lot of people living just outside of Freeport because they can't afford the taxes. It's not about the housing as much as it is taxes. To buy a house, they want to live and buy a house and work in Freeport. So they're living in Durham and Pownell and so on. So I'm just wondering if you can address that, please.
I'm not sure there was a question in there. I think it's a good observation. Was there a question in there? I heard it was a good observation. There's a lot of people
Actually,
moving
it was
to...
multi-questioned. One
Okay.
was numbers of age of people. What is your data showing on that? I'd love to see that. Number two, I guess your data would have to include also the housing in Portland, because that's going to affect our housing here.
Yeah, I think
that's a start.
Are you looking up the median age?
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
bringing up the population.
That is in the population chapter, which is online, and I think Charles can get you a number momentarily. Freeport is part of a larger Portland housing market. It's part of the Portland labor market, so that is a good point. I think someone earlier had said, Freeport isn't going to solve, I'll paraphrase, isn't going to solve the regional housing issue, and that's true. But I think Freeport does need to decide, and hopefully through conversations like this, we can decide what is appropriate for Freeport to take on, and what does that look like in different parts of town.
Yeah, I think just on the age, Freeport is getting older. So from the last 20 years of data that we have from the census, the average age has gone from 40 up to 44 to 47, and that's mirroring Cumberland County, that's mirroring the state of Maine, just an aging population across the state. So while we look at housing solutions and policies, when we're working with the planning board, working with the community, we definitely consider aging in place as an important feature of that, just in terms of where can people downsize when their kids move out and make sure that they can continue living in Freeport. Anything else to add? We can go to the next question.
Hi there. I am really interested in the information about building more rental units here in Freeport. I just obviously see it as a need, but I happen to be a homeowner, but I look around at rental prices and I couldn't afford to rent. The rental prices are at least $1,000 more per month than my mortgage. So I'm wondering if the housing committee and the development has talked about protections for renters, capping rental rates, capping increase on rental rates when there's a turnover of tenants, rental registry so that you know who the landlords are. How can we make Freeport attractive to renters and make it actually affordable to rent? I worry about some of the Portland developments. We talk about developing large multi-unit rental buildings. Are those actually affordable? And how do we hold the developers and landlords to account?
Do you want to speak to the income restrictions on affordable housing?
I'll start with that, and this is, I'm taking off my council hat and putting on just my personal experience hat, that if we had 7,000 or 8,000 units of rental housing in our community, and we had the dynamics going on, then there might be an opportunity to have that conversation about having more rights for renters. But right now, the single biggest reason, in my opinion, again, not as a counselor, but as a member of the housing committee and through my experiences, the number one reason why the price is so high, because there's no supply. Freeport Housing Trust has 183 units, and there's probably less than 50% of that amount in the private sector. We have so few renting households here that if we were to introduce from a town government perspective something about controlling rents or providing voices for tenants to have rights. That has to be regulated by some way. The very few people that are considering doing apartments in our community would run away as fast as they could. And because it is, there's not enough supply here, and there's not enough opportunity to do more to where that could end up being eventually a healthy dynamic for the renters. So I think we need a lot more supply. I hate to be so dismissive of your question, because I think about that a lot in my day job. I work for a nonprofit organization that has a mission to protect affordable housing, but in our community, the needle is so far towards single-family home ownership and so few rental units in our community. We really need just a lot more supply in the downtown areas for renters who are coming and going for jobs, or because they like being here, or they're going to learn how to water ski on Casco Bay, whatever it might be. That we need a lot more supply, I think, before we start trying to regulate that as a local government. Potentially, you know, there might be an opportunity to have something statewide, but I've been in these discussions long enough to know if the state of Maine is going to try and lay something out across municipalities, you better have all of your political will with you, because it's going to be a bumpy ride.
Yes. Yeah.
One of my questions, I have two questions, or thoughts. One's a question, one's a thought. But it kind of complements that. How I'm totally like naive, and I very much value housing, but I'm not in like the housing industry or anything. So like I'm looking towards your expertise. How meaningful is having multi-units be regulated as mixed income types of spaces to help with maintaining some sense of you know, regulations with the prices of rent, and you know, accessing different populations who can afford the different rent? Like, how meaningful is that in housing and potential developments, such as perhaps small units like many of us said we were interested in? And then my other thought is I think it's really important, and this is like totally a separate issue, but somebody else brought it up. I'm a local teacher in a neighboring district, and I think it's really important for the housing group to make sure that the school board and other district-wide leaders in the schools are understanding and informed about some of the decisions because of its impact on schools. And like, I know, because my children have gone through, one of the schools in particular is quite aged, and it takes a very long time to construct perhaps a new school, 5-10 years. And if like those, you know, organizations or committees are not talking to each other,
right,
then we might have success in one, and you know, the other portion of an aging school with an influx of hopefully more families, you know, those can't coexist. And like, housing takes a long time, but so does constructing a new school potentially, or a campus or something like that. And so I just think it's really important that those are, you know, the two entities are aware because of the impact
Good point.
on both. So,
Yep.
that's all. But my first question was this mixed income.
Jeff, do you want to respond to the mixed income question?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways to respond to those needs, but there's definitely a need for below market affordable rentals, and also for kind of what the market is at, which is reasonably high, as was heard earlier. Whether they have to be in the same development or not, I think is a little bit more of a policy question. I think that there are ways to do that. There's ways to have both of them happening through different sort of funding mechanisms, and maybe one is a chance for the town to offer pieces of land for affordable rentals. Another might just be a developer who comes in when the town looks at a site downtown and says, we should zone this for market rate rental housing. But I think that need is there across those various income levels. It's not just a lower income or a higher income need. So however you accomplish that is It's a little bit more sort of the implementation side, but I think they're both there.
Yeah, great.
Thanks. Will efforts to make housing more accessible and affordable in Freeport include a comprehensive plan to stabilize property tax growth?
To stabilize, what was the last part?
Tax burden.
I got it.
I mean, I can respond from a very sort of general sense because this has come up a couple of times here. There is often a concern in every community in the country when the idea of more housing is proposed that the costs of that housing exceed the revenue brought in by that housing. And there definitely are specific situations where that's true, like Ben's example of the town that goes from 4,900 people to 5,000 and suddenly has these new services. Maybe if the schools are just entirely full and you need another elementary school or another school, because if you have one more student, you're just going to explode. I will say that in 90% of the cases when communities do a fiscal impact study of development and then they go back and look at it after it opens, housing creates more revenue than it causes in expenses. And that's true for multifamily, that's true for small lot, single family. It's not as true for large lot, sort of single family that's further out of town. But it's something that's, that question comes up a lot. There's consultants, not me and not Ben, who make their living doing these fiscal impact studies. I read a lot of them because I teach planning, so I want to talk to students about them. I would say almost all of them show that despite those concerns, the revenue from almost every type of housing exceeds the costs to a community, even more so by a large margin if it's multifamily near downtown. And there's also, just incidentally, a lot fewer school kids than people think in these units. Both predicted fewer, but then even fewer in reality. It's weird. I don't know where these school kids are, but they don't show up when you build new multifamily housing. American families don't tend to live in multifamily. And that's just what the data shows. It's not an opinion of mine.
I did want to move in, so we are going into our final 15 minutes here. This final Menti slide is kind of talking about that last portion of this presentation that Jeff did, the housing strategies, so preservation, regulatory, financial, and household base. For the last few questions, because we want to get everyone's in, please ask more like a clear question, and then we'll have one member of the panel answer it to make sure that we get everyone in. So we will go to the next question.
Charles, I'm going to violate that rule. I apologize.
Oh, all right, after Sam.
Yeah, my name is Sam Kapala. I got things off to a start here, and I don't think I mentioned, but I am the chair of the planning board, which is why I got to stand up there and welcome you all here. I just wanted to address a couple things. Number one, the question we got from the internet, how are we monitoring or how are we keeping track of community input? Mm-hmm. You can always come to a planning board meeting. There's always plenty of seating. I've been to a lot of planning board meetings. There's always plenty of seating. So you are welcome to come to a planning board meeting. You are also welcome to go to futurefreeport.com and submit a comment. I really encourage everybody in this room. I know this is a subset of our community that is very engaged. I know a lot of you. You have all done a wonderful job, and I encourage you to keep doing a wonderful job of raising your voices and submitting comments. I also would like you all to encourage your friends to do the same thing, because that's how we're going to reach a broader subset of our community. I also want to say, I think growth over the next 10 years, assuming that we keep on something like the track we've been on, it's not really a choice. Like, the area is growing. It's not just our town, it's neighboring communities. I think our choice, or where we can put our thumbs on the scale, is how do we guide that growth within Freeport? We don't have a magic wand. We don't have a $1 billion trust fund where we can say, okay, we're going to build housing here, here, and here, and not over there. We can't do that. The town is not a developer. But what we can do are guide or make changes to our land use policy to guide growth in a way that makes sense for our community. So I don't think that it's realistic to expect that we're going to say, okay, no more growth downtown or no more growth in rural areas, but we can, as a community, make choices that might guide, push growth toward one place more than another. I know on the planning board we've talked a lot about encouraging growth in the downtown district, and I think that we've heard tonight from Jeff and others that higher density housing is less likely to add to schools, and it's much, much more likely to support a wide variety of local businesses that will cater to those of us who live here and not just the tourists. Obviously, we value tourists and they keep a lot of our town running, but I think it would be great to have more local businesses downtown, and I think that having more people live downtown would really contribute to that. That's kind of where I am. I think putting my thumb on the scale in the ways that I can to encourage housing downtown and encourage a little bit higher density downtown, I think is a really good mix for the community. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen all at once, and it's not going to happen in a really dramatic, scary way. I think if we do it right. I do have a question, which is maybe for Jeff, but really for anyone who wants to take a stab at it. And one thing that I think a lot about, and I think others on the board think a lot about, is how can we, if we set a growth target, say, for our community, if we steer the growth toward the downtown, are there ways that we can protect the rural character of our community in the rest, like say Wolf's Neck or northwest Freeport, on the other side of the highway off of 126 or 125 or 136? Jeff or someone, are there sort of proven ways that we can protect open spaces and limit growth or provide for targeted growth in rural areas where we can protect the rural character of town without infringing on existing landowners' rights to say, okay, you own a 20-acre parcel, all of a sudden you can't subdivide it. That might not be a politically popular move. So I'm sort of looking to you for guidance on what sorts of strategies we might be able to employ here that might protect the rural character of our town without stifling all growth.
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question. I think that obviously the simplest way would be to buy those development rights, but that's not free to a community. Oftentimes the way the communities resolve that issue is by saying, we're not going to take away all the value of this land, but we're going to zone it for, say, 3-acre single-family subdivisions. And there is a feeling that will preserve, say, agricultural land or open space land. In reality, you often end up with 3-acre lot single-family homes in those areas. So you might get the worst of both worlds in some ways, in that you wanted to see the open land, the space preserved. You end up with something that actually probably costs the town more than a lot of other development and maybe even runs a deficit, but you've also lost that open space you wanted to preserve. So providing those property owners with options for getting some economic value for their land, but not sort of having them turn it into a McMansion farm, it's a tough one, but there are tools you can do. You can allow for cluster subdivision, where you might say, you have a 10-acre piece of land, we're going to allow you to put 10 homes on it, but the way you have to do it is on 5,000 square foot lots with the septic behind it, and the rest of the area has to be conserved. That lets you have economic value for your land, and 3/4 of it is permanently preserved. So there are some strategies like that. They take a little more work than just saying, hey, I'm just going to zone it for 3 or 5-acre single-family homes and hope for the best. But there are those sorts of approaches. There's also the possibility of what's called transfer of development rights, where perhaps developers in those areas can actually sell those rights to developers in what are called receiving areas, where there's already sewer and water, where maybe you're not trying to preserve open space, and allow that landowner to get some return and let the development happen somewhere else. That's a little harder to implement, but things like cluster subdivisions, if implemented well, can really help preserve open space in those places where you want to keep it. And I would be the first to say one of the things that I think is important when you build housing in a community is also preserving that agricultural and open space. I'm not the type of person who thinks you need to build everywhere all the time as much as possible. I really don't. I may sound that way tonight, but I really think those open spaces are really important, and they sort of complement one another.
There's a lot of housing tools available, just like there's a lot of housing tools available, there's a lot of rural development tools. I think design is the biggest one, but when you're considering those tools, Sam, I would say rural function or rural character, which is kind of the
community. One of the, I think Jackie, you asked about ages, and in the work that's been done, there is an analysis of ages. You mentioned that average age is going up, but what I noticed when I looked at the statistics is the notable shortage of 20 to 40-year-olds, and that to me is a sign of a missing housing type. You know, smaller, cheaper housing that people start in. And so, you know, I think we have a choice here. We have several choices. One choice is no development or very limited development. And even though the population of Maine is rising, and even though 84,000 new houses have to be built over 10 years, we could decide we want to be a leafy suburb and not have any more. And that's not my own personal point of view, but I wonder if it's the point of view of many people in this town. We will inevitably have more single-family houses. There's, you know, we're zoned in most of the town in rural residential, which means large lots, so it can't get too dense, but those people can and will build 30 houses a year over the next 10 years. The question is whether we want to build denser, smaller houses. And if we do, then it's a question of where they go. But I'm not sure everybody's agreed on that. To me, it's important for the town to have a mix of ages, but I don't know if that's the consensus of the room.
I will jump back to at least the where slide. So just for reference of where people on Zoom, where people in the room have said, where is development? We'll ask the next question. We'll let the panel respond to let them think on Mitch's question.
I had a couple of questions just about the data you presented, and it sort of speaks to what he just said. In terms of the need for new housing, how much of that is to meet a demand of people who already live here, or the next generation that grew up here but wants to live here? So, you know, people who bought their houses in 1970 and they want to stay here, but they want to downsize, but they have no options here. So I think it's a little unclear if we're talking about just accommodating the flood of people coming from everywhere else, or if it's to also serve Freeporters. And then when you talk about new housing and where to put it, are you also considering like existing structures that could be repurposed instead of actually needing to take a different parcel of land or finding parcels and put new structures on them? So for instance, downtown, all the storefronts, how many of those could accommodate apartments upstairs, and or if you change the height limits downtown, could add another story, which could be apartments and that sort of thing, as opposed to new buildings of various kinds. And then your talk about people who live here but don't work here, or work somewhere else and live here. When you're talking about housing, don't you also have to think about sprinkling in also job opportunities that like give a livable wage, not just retail, not just restaurant work. So kind of the use of space almost that exists already. I don't know like how much of that is figured into all of your numbers. And then the last thing is, Melanie Sachs was talking about a program like tax acquired property, that the town would then perhaps use that for building housing. I don't know if I'm making that up, and I don't know whatever became of the program,
very small.
or if that's a state level thing or whatever.
The last one, the town of Freeport has very, very little tax acquired property. We actually go out of our way beyond the usual parameters before the town actually takes a property from non-payment of taxes from somebody. We really want to see success with the people that own the property. So it's very small. There are other communities, and potentially we may end up with something like that in our community, where a former non-housing use, whether it's an industrial or some kind of commercial or a mill or something like that, have opportunities to be reconverted. I don't know of any of those right now in our community, but there certainly are around the state. To your other question about new housing as opposed to putting apartments over existing storefronts, I don't think those are unopposed. I think a new unit is a new unit. So whether you're building 6 new units on this small lot on the corner of Bow Street and whatever, or you're putting 6 units over these row of stores, that's 6 new units. And so I don't think there's an opposition. I think 6 new units is 6 new units. So it's going to include both, or both and kind of approach to that. There are considerable challenges to putting residential use over commercial use. There's state fire code and egress and those kinds of things which can be more expensive, but that's a perfect opportunity for the town to identify those and maybe help make that happen. Maybe we can participate in how we bring a sprinkler line into a building in order to increase or decrease the hurdles that are in place for mixing those uses. But we also can't create something that's not safe.
Awesome. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
I'd just like to make a statement about restaurant workers in Freeport. Because the people that work in my restaurant make more money than the teachers here, the police here, or the fire department here. So please keep that in mind. And you know what? They still can't afford to live here.
We have a question here up front. We can get you a microphone.
And for folks, as the microphone's coming down, for folks who haven't had a chance to ask a question or you have other questions, there is a box out front, and we have some index cards where you can write down questions, and we'll, leave your email address, and we'll get back to you and make sure that that's part of the follow-up too.
My name is Jim Hughes, and I've lived in Sparko for 38 years. The Planning Commission and the Housing Commission are all trying to increase the number of housing units available. The Appeals Board is doing everything they can to stop housing. Now, I've got to sue the town to use my property the way the zoning ordinance says I can use it. One of my neighbors hired a lawyer who convinced the code enforcement officer, well, they're friends, but there's a certain conflict of interest there. They convinced the appeals board that, oh yeah, no, that's not buildable lot. I talked to one of the appeals board members who just finished, and I said, how can you guys come to that conclusion? He says, well, we can come to any conclusion we want. We don't report to the town council. We don't report to anybody.
Well,
in a matter of fact, they still have to obey the zoning ordinance. And they feel they don't have to. That's got to be fixed.
Well, I can't speak to your specific situation, but I think one of the values, one of the important things about doing a planning process like this is a chance to get everyone on the same page, to make sure that everyone's kind of pulling in the same direction from a policy standpoint. I don't know if there's anything else to say about, a specific case in town, but I think that in general, having an agreed upon policy statement of what's important to the town can help make sure that everyone's pulling in the same direction.
That would be the zoning ordinance. Which the appeals board doesn't follow.
Do we have one final question to end off the evening?
Thank you. I am so thrilled to see us spending so much time talking about housing. We know that it's a very important economic factor for the downtown. In our businesses, there's many businesses in the downtown, we drive through and say, wow, it looks wonderful. But there's a lot of businesses that are just kind of hanging on because they believe in that more housing downtown is going to make their businesses more viable. So I also have the question of how can we move correctly but fast because
Faster.
we want developers to be here. And if
Yep.
you look around us now, look at Brunswick, look at all these areas where a lot of housing is happening because people are helping developers come. And I think we need to take that into account here because our businesses downtown, they're waiting for us to do this. So, and that's a big economic factor for Freeport. That helps my real estate taxes stay low. So, good and fast, can we do it both?
Jeff or John, do you want to take a stab at that answer?
Well, that's not anything new to the council. If you're not studying our town government really closely, we have a planning board that you heard from Sam. We have a project review board. In many communities, the planning board also handles permits and applications. We've separated that in our community. And the project review board doesn't sort of send its decisions up to the council. The project review board is empowered by our structure right now to make those decisions, and then it would go to an appeals board after that, and then to the courts. So as the council, we can try and we are actually working on simplifying a lot of those rules. That's what a number of the efforts that our various committees are working on, including our economic development activity, to try and find ways to get specifically at what are the very detailed issues that are preventing or discouraging developers to come to our community. This is a demand place. People want to live here. We know that. And so if there's demand, there should be some supply, and there's not any supply. And you put your finger right on it, Mary, and it's because the people who provide that supply don't want to mess with our process. They're afraid of it, or they're intimidated by it, or they're disgusted by it, or whatever their verb may be. So we have to change that. And people can disagree with me about my strategy. My personal strategy is I don't think we have the time to wait for all of the evolutions to come through a large process. I think, in my opinion, personally, I think the town could do something tangible and dramatic. I'm taking that as an example from a larger city. The city of Bangor is taking its steps, and they're waiting for they're waiting for supply to show up in their community, much bigger city than we have, and they're taking steps to actually go ahead and design a land use plan, bring utilities to the site, and then permit it in the name of the town government or the city government. And so it may be, and there are a number of councilors here who've heard me kind of speculate on this, and it may be like 6-1, like, Egan, you're crazy. But I think it's time, in order to do something sooner and get something going, to prime the marketplace, so to speak. I think the town, with good input, needs to take an active step forward. Instead of setting the table, I think we need to bring the turkey onto the table and start carving it.
Awesome. So with that, I'm going to call it here. Again, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our panelists, John, Jeff, and Ben. This presentation will be active and accessible online. It will be posted on the Future Freeport website, and we will update it. There is another environment workshop in 2 weeks on October 7th at the Freeport High School for the environment, and then November 18th. So thank you all for coming, and have a good night. Thanks. And if you brought a kid, don't forget them.